Hi, thanks so much. I want to talk about the decision support tools that the Bay Program has developed and some of the ways they're being used for within local jurisdictions. These decision support tools were developed coming out of the 2010 TMDL as the jurisdictions were developing their phase 2 WIPs for the Bay TMDL. And so we have, at this point, a suite of 4 different tools. We have CAST, and these are all available online. We have CAST, we have MAST, which is the Maryland version, we have BayFAST, which is the Virginia version, and we have BayFAST, which is a site-specific planning tool. What happened with the phase 2 WIPs is that the states were developing their WIPs and they were sending scenarios to the Bay Program. They would get results back, and that would take several weeks, and they couldn't get enough information to do a really good plan, and it was very difficult to involve local jurisdictions when the state has put together a scenario. So they wanted a tool that local jurisdictions could access, that anybody can access and use. So that's where the tools originally came from. BayFAST is the one we've developed most recently. Special thanks to Jessica Riggleman and Andy Fitch for doing that. BayFAST is site-specific, so that's the one I want to talk about today. One of the important things to know about the tools is that they approximate the loads coming out of the watershed model. So these were developed so that we have the same assumptions, same calculations, same loads coming out that come out of the watershed model, and you have that consistency. So we use all the same delivery factors, we use all of that same information so that when you run a scenario through the online tool, you know that that's almost what you're going to get out of the watershed model. And there are a couple places where it's a little different, but you know, for urban it's spot on, and then for ag there's some variations, but that's 95% of the time it's within 10% of the watershed model. So the way these tools got used originally was with the phase 2 WIPs. Recently they've been used for local TMDLs. So I was at EPA Philadelphia 2 weeks ago, and they were talking about using them in developing local TMDLs for small watersheds. I know that Maryland is talking to jurisdictions about how to use BayFAST when you're coming up with a plan for how to reduce your load from a local TMDL. And they just say, look, the local TMDL was developed with whatever methodology, monitoring and modeling, and whatever model, but just figure out from that local TMDL what the % reduction was, and then run 2 scenarios through the tool and see if you get the same % reduction. And so there can be complications related to concentrations, and people have to do conversions. You got to make sure the land uses match and the geographic specificity matches, which is where BayFAST is so helpful. But that's where Maryland has gone with using BayFAST, and I know that some other states are talking about that too. So I want to walk you through this process of what BayFAST looks like, how you enter BMPs for your initial scenario, your baseline scenario, and then you can add on additional BMPs to have your plan for the future, and then do that comparison and see what the difference is. So this is the BayFAST homepage. Anybody can get a login. You just click here to create an account. There are high school students doing projects. There are people in New Zealand using it. I do not know why we have New Zealand users, because it's only for the Chesapeake Bay, but we do. There are people from all over using it. What we have here are a list of facilities. I just want to show you what this tool looks like. I'm not going to do a full demo, but we can click on the District of Columbia, for example, and you can see a map here. We can scroll in. There's the White House, front and center. We could do a plan for the White House and define this area just by drawing on a map and say, okay, that's where I'm interested. I want to save that and do a plan for that area. And I can share this so I can collaborate with others. And I can edit the land use. So this is just kind of a default land use that pops back. And I can go in here and say, oh wait, most of this actually is regulated. Let me change that. And there's no construction, that's good. Most of this is actually in a CSS, combined sewer system. And I can make these changes and click save. And then I have my scenario. Then I can go under and create a scenario, and I just want to show you what this looks like. And I'll just show you this example that I've already created. And you can look at it by sector. And here's an example with these land uses. And then here's some BMPs I've already added, filtering practices, buffers, permeable pavement, and I can add more BMPs simply by selecting from the list and putting it down on the land use I select and putting down either a percent or the acres treated. And it's that easy to add your BMP. And here it is down here. I just added those bioswales. And you'll notice we also have the cost. This is the cost per acre. So you can see what is cost effective. So it's not just which BMPs can I put in place and how effective will those be, but what is the cost of that BMP. And then when you've entered your results, you just click your BMPs, you can just click there and it will calculate your results for you. And you can see here we have the loads from each of those sectors, and we have these total annualized costs. And then when you scroll down on this page, it has all of the detail about the loads in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. So this coincides very nicely with the TMDL, with the data that the watershed model produces. You can get more detail by expanding this. And then you can go and compare this to other scenarios. So I can click a location here, a facility. And here I have a White House one that I did with a couple of plans. And I've created 3 scenarios. I did a baseline where I said, well, what were the BMPs that were in place in a particular year? And I can say, what were the BMPs in place in, say, 2005? And that may be our start year that we're going back to. Or if we're looking at the TMDL, what was in place in 2009 for the Bay TMDL? And then my next scenario will be my plan. Okay, looking out to, say, 2017 or 2025, or whatever the year is, I can say, well, what BMPs do we expect to have there in place? And I can put those BMPs in my scenario, and then I can compare. And then just for the heck of it, I create a scenario with no BMPs, and let's just see what that would look like. And you click compare, and then you can look at the costs. So with no BMPs, of course, there's 0 cost. We've got a baseline, and then that cost increases because of the BMPs in it. We've got the acres in that land use, and then nitrogen. And you can look at the nitrogen loads from those 3 scenarios. So looking at edge of stream, not what was delivered to the bay, but what was delivered to, in this case, the Potomac. And you can see what the load was from this scenario. So with no BMPs, we are at about 324 pounds. With the 2009 condition, 302. And then with the BMPs for our future plan, it drops to 260. So it's very easy to look at that and say, am I hitting the load I need to hit if I've got that load in terms of pounds? If I want to figure out pounds per acre, we also have acres, and you can just divide that out. And then if you wanted to do percent comparison and say, well, 260 is what percent of 302? A lot of people ask us how you calculate that, so we made it easy for people and did the calculation for them and gave them the percent difference. So you can see that you've got a 25, almost 26% reduction between those 2 scenarios and that are going on across. So we have all of that here. You can download this information and it comes out in much more detailed way, so that's useful for people. And we also have a lot of documentation, which really gets at making much of this modeling that happens at the Bay program transparent. So we have about BayFAST if you wanted more information. We have extensive help that's available with all kinds of questions and answers, and as part of the help. That was a good one. Why are my costs so high? That's a question we get a lot. And then we have the detail about how the calculations work. A lot of times we'll have engineers at private consulting firms who will call and ask me questions about those. And then we have all this source data. This source data is the same source data that's used in the Bay Program's models, Scenario Builder and the Watershed Model. So whenever people want that kind of information, it's easy to come here because this is kept up to date. So whenever a new BMP is added to the Chesapeake Bay Program models, it is also added into Scenario Builder and is reflected in all of this data. So we have various recordings and training materials, and then all kinds of information available on models and that people might want to use in addition to this tool. I wanted to show you quickly the MDE's TMDL Data Center. They have done a great job of putting in place information so that they're telling people how to use BayFAST or their state version MAST for calculating this. If you go through these boxes, you just click on them and the information pops up. Here we have under this page the stormwater implementation resources. You can scroll through here and they will give you step by step how to do these calculations. And they have here a presentation with the steps for how to do it, and they show you how to use this website and the tools available, and then how to do these calculations in MAST and to deal with some of those issues related to the land use that may be in a TMDL, where it could be very general like ag, and then the Bay program has a dozen or so land uses that are agriculture, and how to split that out and how to create a plan using MAST, and they have a whole document on doing that. So that's useful information that you can find on that MDE TMDL stormwater page. So I wanted to show that to y'all and let you know that people are using this at the state level for milestones. They used it for WIPs. They use it for other reasons as well. And people are using it in local jurisdictions to come up with plans. Plans related to permits, plans related to local TMDLs, and plans, of course, related to the Bay TMDL. So it's a great way to involve all kinds of people. I know that I've presented this to high school students, and high school students have done projects to figure out what the loads would be and to get an understanding of how to manage the landscape and what's coming off, and to get a better understanding of, well, do we treat something once it hits the edge of a stream and prevent it from going into the waterways, into the groundwater, or do we do something to make sure the loads don't get on the ground in the first place, looking at changing the applications through other management strategies. So, that kind of information and seeing what works best and the cost has been really instructive to people. So whether you use it for actually a plan that has regulatory emphasis behind it, or you use it as a learning tool, I think it's a useful tool. It's really one of the first times the Bay program has provided a decision support tool to an open, broad audience so that anybody can go in and use it.